Hi guys, we are going to discuss the procedures involved in collecting evidence from the crime scene. And we're going to get into the basic overview of the different types of evidence you might find at a crime scene and what the collection requirements are for each of those. We are going to review chain of custody, and we're going to talk about the proper procedures for collecting and packaging various types of physical evidence, and then get into some details about certain types of evidence. All right, so the JonBenet Ramsey case is very famous strictly by how badly it was handled. It was Christmas, and her family found her dead at the bottom of the stairs in the basement. And because it was Christmas and I guess people were bored, I don't know, a lot of people were allowed to access this crime scene that should not have been. Like, everybody and their cousin was there. Also, the body was moved before it was processed. And so from the contamination of the evidence to the mishandling of the scene, all of these mistakes have probably significantly contributed to the fact that her case is still not solved. So it is essential to protect and process a scene correctly so that the individuals that are responsible for the crime can be identified and charged and prosecuted and hopefully convicted. The evidence from the scene is going to allow forensic scientists to reconstruct the sequence of events of a crime, and it can also help validate or invalidate witness testimony, identify suspects, weapon, the cause of death, any potential victims, and place suspect weapons or victims at the scene. As we've discussed before, the laws around evidence collection are very highly regulated underneath the Fourth Amendment, and so most of the time you're going to have gotten a warrant from a judge, with some exceptions, in order to search and seize property and seize evidence. Evidence, defined, is an object or substance or type of proof that is used to indicate alleged facts of a case, often presented in a court of law. And it is obtained by finding, collecting, and preserving any matter that may help with the case, and is collected by the Crime Scene Investigation Unit. Movies and TV really like to portray a single piece of definitive evidence, like a fingerprint or DNA, as the thing that proves a suspect's guilt. In reality, it takes multiple pieces of evidence in various forms to develop a case. And these forms of evidence are going to come in three main types. You're going to have testimonial evidence, documentary evidence, and physical evidence. Although some could argue that documentary evidence is physical evidence. Testimonial evidence is going to be eyewitness statements, victim statements, and expert testimony. Documentary evidence is going to be documents, audio, video, or digital information like text messages or social media posts. Physical evidence is any material relevant to the crime, such as impressions or hair or blood or weapons. Physical evidence can be broken down further to about 5 different types. There's transient evidence, pattern evidence, conditional evidence, transfer evidence, and associative evidence. The transient evidence is something that is going to be easily lost or changed because it's temporary, and it's the first type of evidence to be collected. Some examples would be observations of odors, like perfume or cigarette smoke, or the temperature of the room or a body, or coffee on a coffee table, or certain impressions or indentations that might be lost due to weather, so footprints in mud or snow, or indentations from furniture on carpet can easily be lost. Mud, if it dries, it'll distort the print. Snow will melt. Indentations from the furniture and the carpet can be vacuumed over and lost, or stepped on and lost. Pattern evidence is markings that you get when one surface contacts another. That's going to be indentations, an imprint, a striation, which is a scratch mark, a fracture, or a deposition. So footprints, blood stains, glass fracture patterns, tire tracks, bite marks are all pattern evidence. Conditional evidence is anything that's going to give information on the scene or helps reconstruct the scene. So like lights, position of the body, evidence of a disturbance, locked or unlocked windows or doors. Transfer evidence is anything that is transferred when two objects come into contact. So blood, fluids, hairs, fibers, paint chips, skin can be considered transfer evidence. And these typically are also going to be known as your trace evidence because they're found in very small amounts. And then associative evidence is something that demonstrates either an association between the victim and the suspect, or the victim and the scene, or the suspect and the scene. So the victim's belongings at the scene, the suspect's DNA underneath the victim's fingernails. These are associative evidence. Evidence can also be classified as either class or individual evidence based on analysis. Class evidence is anything that will narrow the identity of the object to a specific group. So, for example, if you find a .38 caliber bullet or shell casing on a crime scene, that indicates that a .38 caliber handgun was used at the scene. But that does not necessarily identify the specific gun that shot the bullet. Individual evidence is something that can narrow the identity to a single person or thing. And DNA is the most classic form of individual evidence. But we'll also talk about different things that be considered individual evidence, such as the striations on a bullet that can be matched to the gun that shot it. In court, the evidence is either going to be labeled direct or circumstantial. Direct evidence is evidence based on knowledge of a fact. That is photographs, audio or video recordings, eyewitness testimony. Circumstantial evidence is something that implies a fact but does not directly prove anything. So here's the trick. Most people want to think that direct evidence is the most reliable form of evidence. But eyewitness testimony can actually be very unreliable because different people recall things differently. You're under stress sometimes when you witness something and it affects your ability to recall correctly. So direct evidence always has to be backed up by physical evidence. Physical evidence is circumstantial. Once you collect evidence, you are going for one of two things, or sometimes both. You either want to know what it is, or you want to know, does it match up to a known sample, or do two unknown samples match up? Are they similar? Okay. Processing the crime scene is analyzing and interpreting the scene and uncovering and collecting evidence. This procedure is going to probably be slightly different depending on the department or jurisdiction that you're working in, but in every case, law enforcement officials have to organize and execute a plan for processing the scene successfully and efficiently because your access to the scene is temporary and undiscovered evidence has the potential to be destroyed. When processing the crime scene, the primary goal is to understand the events of the crime. You want to know who, what, when, and where. Not necessarily why. Crime scene investigators don't worry about why. So the process for processing a crime scene, your first responder has to first secure the crime scene. They have to make sure that everybody is safe. They have to set up a perimeter and make sure nobody goes in or out that isn't supposed to be, and that has to be logged. And they need to obtain information from the witnesses. These witnesses need to be separated so they don't collude, which means they don't talk to each other and change their story. The information collected from the witnesses can be used by the crime scene investigators to locate the evidence and understand the crime scene. So when the crime scene investigators arrive, they will interview the victim and the witnesses and the first responders to understand the events of the crime before they get on the scene. Then they will do an initial walkthrough to generate theories and look for potential evidence. Then the scene has to be photographed and sketched so that it can be reconstructed. They do long-range photos, then they do a medium-range photo, and then they will photograph the individual pieces of evidence with and without a measuring device. They will also take photos from several different angles so the scene is depicted accurately, and then they'll go in to do the rough sketch of the crime scene sketch. So then, after all of that has been done, then the scene is systematically searched using one of the search methods that we've talked about previously. And then, and only then, after all of those things have been done, is when you finally collect and secure the evidence, beginning with the most fragile or easily lost evidence first. And you have to do this using the proper method and maintain the chain of custody. So we've talked about this a little bit before, but we're going to reiterate. If the evidence is going to remain admissible in court, you have to be able to prove that the evidence was not tampered with or contaminated. So to do that, you have to use personal protective equipment when you're handling your evidence. You have to package that evidence correctly, and you have to maintain the chain of custody. The personal protective equipment, or PPE, that you will use on a crime scene include gloves, masks or respirators, coveralls, head coverings, booties, and goggles. And whereas protection from exposure to diseases through bodily fluids is a concern, the PPE is primary function is actually to keep you from contaminating the evidence with your own biological fluids or hair or fingerprints or what have you. So you have to wear your PPE in order to make sure you don't put something on that evidence that isn't supposed to be there. We have gotten so good at DNA technology that they can get DNA from a few cells from somebody touching something. So that could be the victim, that could be the suspect, or that could be the crime scene investigator if they have not worn the appropriate PPE. It also has made it real easy to contaminate objects by contact because that stuff can be transferred. So with that in mind, you must change your gloves every time you touch something new. You need to change your booties often. And all of the personal protective equipment has to be bagged and maintained in custody with the rest of the evidence after the scene is processed. So each piece of evidence is going to be packaged in its own appropriate packaging, and then all of that is going to go into a larger package and then held in police custody. What the kind of packaging is going to depend on what it is you are collecting. Most commonly, you're going to use paper envelopes or packets or bags. Liquid evidence has to be stored in a non-breakable, leak-proof container. Arson evidence has to be stored in a metal can that will prevent the vapors from any possible accelerants from escaping. Anything that is wet must be allowed to dry before it's being packaged. Then each container has to be sealed in an appropriate way with tamper-evident tape placed over the top of the seal, and then the investigator is going to initial that tamper-evident tape. Evidence has to be packaged in an appropriate size container. So you do not put very small things in very large containers. You do not put very large things in very small containers. Extremely small and fragile evidence, like hair and fiber, is also typically packaged in a paper bindle before it is stored into an evidence container. So to make one, this is also called a druggist fold, because old-time pharmacists would use this to package powders, for like when they would mix powders in with liquids in order to drink them. So what you would do is you take a standard size piece of paper. It's like a piece of copy paper. You have to fold it into a 3x3 square. So you would fold it in thirds one way, and then you would fold it in thirds the other way. So now you have 9 squares. You place your piece of evidence in the very center square. Then you would fold the left side of the evidence of the paper over, then the right, and then the top, and then the bottom. You tape that closed, and then you put it in the evidence bag, and then you seal the evidence bag with the tamper-evident tape and initial tape. And then again, you have to maintain your chain of custody, because if you break that, then the evidence becomes inadmissible. So each evidence container, each box, can, baggie, envelope, has to be marked with the name of the collector, the date and time it was collected, a description of the evidence, where it was found, the investigating agency's name, and the file number. Then that has to be updated each time the evidence changes custody. So when they take it from the scene, they're going to take it to the evidence lockup, and it's going to be signed out that this person has checked it in, and this person has received it. And then if it's checked out of custody, then it has to be signed out who's checking it out, to whom, and then that analyst, anytime they open up one of these containers to do an analysis, they would have to break the seal on the tamper-evident tape. They would do their analysis, put it back, reseal it with a new label or with a new piece of tamper-evident tape. They would initial over that they have now resealed it. And then, like, on the chain of custody form, they have to list, why was it opened? What was the purpose of unsealing it and looking at it? What did you do to it? And then that has to be done every time that evidence changes hands. You have to update that chain of custody form. And so therefore, that evidence needs to be handled as little as possible to minimize the chance for contamination. So only people that really need to look at the evidence should be looking at the evidence. Common evidence that you're going to find at a crime scene is going to include trace evidence, body fluids, hairs, fibers, fingerprints, ballistic evidence, documents, and impression evidence. And each one of these has their own particular way that you're going to collect them and their own particular preferred packaging to use. All right. So biological evidence is anything that could potentially have DNA in it. So we're mostly talking about body fluids. DNA identification is like the gold standard for evidence, because that is definitely unique to the individual. So you have to handle all of these biological samples with care to make sure you don't destroy the evidence. You also need to be careful that you don't expose yourself to bloodborne pathogens like hepatitis or HIV or whatever. The main reason why biological evidence is collected is to identify somebody or establish a link between people or places. The body fluids you're going to be looking at include blood, sexual evidence such as semen or vaginal secretions, saliva, vomit. You may also have stomach contents or vitreous humor, which is the jelly in your eyeball. To collect these, you'll use things such as smear slides, scalpels, tweezers, scissors, sterile cloth squares, so gauze strips, UV lights. If you have a liquid blood stain, you're going to soak it up on a gauze pad allow that gauze pad to dry, package it in a paper bag or a paper box, and then submit it to the lab as soon as possible, because a lot of the time this may need to be refrigerated to keep the DNA from breaking down. It is imperative that you use paper when packaging anything that contains DNA, because any type of moisture that still exists in that packaging, like if it was plastic, plastic doesn't breathe. So then you've just introduced the potential for mold or bacteria to grow in that package, which will destroy your DNA. If you have dried blood, preferably you take the whole object that it's on, wrap it in paper, and take it back to the lab. But if you can't, you are going to scrape as much of that dried blood as you can into a paper bindle and submit it. You have to use a fresh knife for every unique blood stain to avoid cross-contamination, because you can't tell from looking if two blood pools are from the same person. Sexual evidence. So in the cases of sexual assault, swabs for sexual evidence are going to be done by the treating physician at the hospital. They have a protocol for responding to this type of crime. If there are fluids found on clothing or bed clothing, then that's going to be allowed to dry, and then the whole thing is going to be packaged in paper and submitted. Saliva evidence, like what you would find on cigarette butts or gum or drink containers, if you can take the object, you take it. And then you're going to need to take a buccal swab, which is where they take a Q-tip and they rough it on the inside of your cheek. They take one from any suspects and the victim and anybody else that may be involved, so to either be able to compare the DNA, to either confirm a match or eliminate the evidence that is not like really evidence. So you would expect to find DNA from people that belong to a household. You'd expect to find their DNA everywhere. Same thing with fingerprints. You need these samples as elimination samples. Anthropological evidence is kind of unique. You're going to run across this when you have a body that has decomposed to the point that it is unrecognizable. It could be severely decomposed, it could be dismembered, or it's been destroyed in some way. And so they're going to rely on the teeth and the bones to try to figure out what happened. And so you're going to have to call in a specialist, a forensic anthropologist, to collect this evidence and determine whether it really is human or animal bone, or if you've got more than one human involved. And then you can look at those anthropological remains, the forensic anthropologist can, to find the age, biological characteristics, any trauma, try to identify the person, get their dental records. Sometimes you can get DNA, and sometimes you can try to reconstruct the face, although that method is not terribly reliable. They don't view it as very reliable. To get the most accurate identification, you need the skull and the pelvis, and then your long bones, like your humerus, ulna, radius, tibia, fibula, and femur, are going to be useful for DNA. You want them complete and uncut, preferably, but if not, you need to collect as much of the bone fragments as possible. You have to photograph and document the order that the bones were found, and the position of the bones may give you insight to the case. So you have to make sure you document all that before the bones are removed. You have to remove the soil and shallow layers, identify anything else found under the grave. You have to reveal the whole skeleton. You don't remove soil inside crevices such as the eye holes. Photograph the skeleton, then you remove it starting with the skull, one bone at a time. All of this will be done under the supervision of a forensic anthropologist. a lot of the time they're going to be the only individual allowed to remove the remains from the scene. Dental remains also need to be collected as completely as possible. You do not pull teeth from the jaw. And that's going to usually involve a forensic odontologist or forensic dentist. Trace evidence are the very, very small pieces of evidence that are typically transferred through physical contact during a crime. There's a principle called Locard's exchange principle that says whenever two objects come into contact, there will be physical evidence transferred. Trace evidence is extremely useful for linking a suspect to a victim or one or the other to a location. This can include gunshot residue, paint residue, chemicals, drugs, glass, soil. You're going to pick this up using tweezers. Most of it can be packaged in plastic containers, and in some cases you can use a special filtered vacuum to pick them up. Hair at the scene of a crime, you can't really get DNA from hair. There's a specific instance that has to be true for getting DNA from hair, but you can analyze hair to determine if you have two samples from the same origin. You can look at the hair to determine the race and sex and approximate age of the individual. You can also tell where on the body the hair came from. Has it been altered, like bleached or dyed, whether it was shed naturally or pulled out forcibly. And we'll get into this in more detail in our hair and fibers unit. You are going to pick it up off of objects with tweezers and place it in paper bindles. If you are taking it from a person, you're going to comb through their hair and then, or shake their hair over a piece of paper, and then you have to pull. And you need to get 50 to 100 hairs to have a good sample for comparison from a person. If a hair is caught in something, like it's attached in dried blood or caught in a crack, you don't want to pull it out. You're going to take the whole item and send it to the laboratory. You're going to need to collect hair samples from all involved parties for comparison and elimination purposes. And again, if what you have is pubic hair, then you are going to have to use the same method for obtaining a hair sample from the head on the pubic region. You're going to comb to get any loose hairs, and then you're going to have to pull hairs. And for pubic region, it's going to be 30 to 60 hairs instead of 50 to 100. Fibers are going to be small units of textiles like clothes or carpet or bedding. They can be analyzed to determine where they came from and what type of fiber they are. You will see these in hit and runs. You may also see these in burglaries. It can prove contact between two people. So it is important to make sure that something with potential fibers evidence does not contact anything else to make sure the fibers are not accidentally transferred. So when you are submitting fibers, you have to send all the relevant clothing from the involved individuals to compare with, as well as any other likely sources of the fibers. You're going to collect these using tweezers or knives or clippers. They're typically wrapped in paper bundles and then put in sealed containers. Some jurisdictions do allow the use of tape or like the hair roller things to be used. Fibers are very commonly overlooked because they are not very easily seen. Glass evidence is another type of trace evidence. It's very common in vehicle accidents and burglaries. You can analyze it to figure out where it came from and also the direction and type of force that was used to break it. If you have shoes or clothing that have glass on them, they need to be wrapped in paper and submitted to the lab. If you're going to try to match it to a source like a broken headlight, then all of the fragments need to be collected. If someone's been injured with glass, then you have to search the wound to look for the glass fragments, and those have to be recovered. Extremely small fragments can be collected with a clean vacuum cleaner with a special filter. Small fragments can be picked up with tweezers into a paper bindle, put in a coin envelope or a pill bottle or a film canister. Larger fragments need to be wrapped in tissue and then placed in a box. Unlike most other types of evidence, glass can actually be packaged together to limit the amount of packaging required, because if you had to put each individual fragment of glass in its own little container, you'd need like 1 billion containers for one crime scene. Paint evidence is another type of trace evidence, very common in hit and runs and burglaries. They can look at the paint to determine its color, the texture, the chemical composition. They can look at the number of layers. They can use all this information to try to figure out who made it. They can find the make and model of the automobile that may have left it behind, or they can use paint transfer to identify a tool that may have been used on a windowsill or something for a burglary. If you have paint transfer, you're going to flake it off with a clean knife into a paper bindle and then submit that. You need to sample paint transfer from all of the areas where it's present, since the nature of the paint can vary from place to place. Firearms or ballistic evidence is going to include guns, bullets, casings. It can be used to, you can test the firearm to determine the bullet pattern or striations. You can measure the distance of a gun to an entrance wound. You can identify casing and tool mark impressions on the gun and on the bullet casings. You can collect gunshot residue from the suspect or the victim, and you can examine clothing with gunshot holes in it. So, especially in the case of the gunshot residue and potential fingerprints being on the gun, you have to collect the firearms evidence using gloves. Finding a firearm can be very beneficial in reconstructing a scene. You can also examine the gun for modifications. You can test it to figure out, did it discharge accidentally? Did it have a silencer? What's the ejection pattern of the gun? You can potentially match the bullets and the cartridge casings or the shot shell casings to the specific weapon it came from. You must unload the gun before you submit it as evidence. It also needs to be handled as little as possible. You don't let anything enter the barrel or any other operating part of the gun. You're going to pack it in a strong cardboard box or a wooden box in a way that prevents it from shifting, so zip tying it down. And then the bullets, cartridge casings, ammunition also needs to be collected. Each individual bullet or cartridge should be wrapped in paper without being wiped or cleaned in any way. Fingerprints are impressions or marks made from your fingertips that you can use to identify people. You're going to look for them in places where the perpetrator is likely to have touched something. You are going to recover it by typically taking the whole object that you think has the fingerprints on it and processing it in the lab. Although in some cases, you're going to have to use fingerprint powder to illuminate and then collect the fingerprint if the object's too big to take to the lab. Fingerprints can be useful in identifying a suspect or a victim, or to prove contact between an object or person. There are different types of fingerprints that we're going to get more into in the fingerprints unit, but you can find it either by transfer of blood or paint or other fluids. You can illuminate hidden prints or latent prints with powder or some other chemicals. They can also be left on objects that are soft, like soap or wax or putty. You identify these using tools such as brushes, different powders, different chemicals, and then super glue. And then you would collect them using a magnifying glass to determine if they're usable, and then you lift them with tape, you put them on a lift card. So you have to collect fingerprints using gloves because you have fingerprints too. So you don't ever touch anything that might have fingerprints on it with your bare hands. Other types of impression evidence can include footprints or palm prints. They can also be used to identify individuals. These prints can show up on porous and non-porous surfaces. Porous means if I get it wet, it's going to soak up the water. So untreated wood, paper, cardboard, fabric, and tissue are porous. Non-porous surfaces are if I spill water on it, it's just going to be a water puddle. So glass, plastic, metal, ceramic, and glossy paints are non-porous. You can package porous objects together. You cannot package non-porous objects together. So porous objects can go together. Non-porous objects have to be packaged separately in a way that does not allow shifting. If you cannot take the whole item to the lab, you're typically going to use black powder, although there are some cases where different colors of powder would be better. And then any usable print is photographed and then lifted, put onto a piece of white paper or a fingerprint card, and then taken to the lab. And then you need to take exclusionary prints from all involved parties to compare, so you know what is actually an evidentiary print and what is not. Other impressions can include footwear, bite marks, tire marks, and tool marks. And so typically you're going to cast these. So you can use an impression mold or a 3D mold or an adhesive lifter or 2D mold or just a photograph if it's a high enough resolution camera. Narcotics and controlled substances. We're going to get into the different definitions of narcotics and controlled substances later. It's real important that you use your personal protective equipment to make sure you don't expose yourself to these substances. They can be analyzed to determine what they are, what their properties are, how much you have. They come in various forms. So you can have powders, tablets, or capsules, liquids, plants, and hypodermic syringes. Powders are going to be collected in a sealed container like a plastic bag or a pill box or an envelope, and then carefully separated based on appearance and location. Tablets and capsules can be placed in plastic bags or their original container, and then they're separated by appearance and location. Liquids need to be stored in a leak-proof container and refrigerated, possibly. Plants and vegetation need to be dried before they're packaged in a paper bag. If you have the whole plant, you take the entire plant with dirt from the roots. Most labs won't take more than 4 plants. So if you have large samples, you don't have to submit every plant there. Hypodermic syringes need to be placed in a biohazard safety tube. Most crime labs do not allow hypodermic syringes to be submitted under typical circumstances. So if it's potential narcotic evidence in the syringe, that evidence needs to be emptied into a vial for submission. In the case of bulk seizures of narcotics, they need to make special arrangements with the lab on how to handle that large amount of evidence. Toxicological evidence is different because you're going to be taking that from a person, not a crime scene. So we're talking about measuring the presence of alcohol, drugs, or poisons in the body. And that's going to help understand circumstances that may have impacted the suspect or the victim or may give you cause of death. So we're talking about various bodily fluids. If it's blood, you're going to need 10 milliliters of blood, and it needs to be collected no later than 24 hours after the incident because a lot of substances will filter through the body in a short amount of time. Urine samples, you need 100 or at least 30 milliliters of urine, and again, you need to get that within 120 hours after the incident. You're going to refrigerate both of those. You can collect hair to test for toxicology. You use the standard method for hair. Medical examiners are going to be the ones that collect toxicological evidence from somebody that is dead. And they do that during the autopsy. They can get blood and urine during an autopsy, as well as vitreous fluid, which is, again, the liquid that's in your eyeball. And then they will look at stomach contents, portions of the liver, brain, and kidney to figure out if some poison has been metabolized. And the last kind of evidence is documents, which can include diaries, planners, phone books, suicide notes. It's kind of a long list. You can analyze them to determine forgeries. You can match handwriting, and then you can also look at what type of machine was used to produce the document. These are collected while wearing gloves. Most of them can be submitted in plastic bags or paper bags, and then they can be taken and analyzed for various pieces of evidence. All right, so that's kind of a long-winded, but that's going to sum up the different collection procedures for each different type of evidence that you may be exposed to on a crime scene. Internet is screwy.